What if I told you the story of America did not begin with the Pilgrims? More than 50 years before the Mayflower, Europeans established a settlement here. In 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, Florida. That means one of the oldest chapters of what would become the United States was written in Spanish, not English. And that is only the beginning. Because the country we now call the United States of America rarely survived long enough to become a superpower. This is the story of how a collection of colonies became one of the most powerful nations the world has ever seen. And it begins with land that already belonged to others. Long before anyone called this place America, millions of indigenous people lived across the continent. They had nations, languages, trade routes, governments, armies, cities, and communities. This was not an empty land waiting to be discovered. Then ships began appearing on the horizon. Spanish explorers came, the French came, the Dutch came, and eventually, the British came. Europe had discovered something it desperately wanted: land, resources, and power. And soon, North America became a battlefield for empires. By the 1700s, Britain controlled 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. But something was changing. The colonists were becoming controlled and increasingly unwilling to be controlled from thousands of miles away. Britain had spent enormous amounts of money fighting wars. Now London wanted the colonies to help pay the bill. Taxes followed. The colonists became furious. Their message was simple: why should Britain tax us when we have no real representation in Parliament? Violence followed. And then came the moment when compromise became almost impossible. War. 1775, fighting erupted between American colonists and British forces. Britain possessed one of the most powerful militaries on Earth. The Americans were fighting an empire. On paper, they should have lost. But on July 4, 1776, colonial leaders made an extraordinary decision. They declared themselves independent. The United States of America was being born. But there was one enormous problem. Declaring independence was easy. Surviving Britain was not. George Washington and his army suffered defeats, hunger, disease, and brutal winters. Men deserted, money disappeared. At times, the revolution looked close to collapse, but the Americans continued fighting. France eventually entered the conflict against Britain, providing crucial military assistance. And in 1783, Britain recognized American independence. The impossible had happened. David had survived Goliath. America was free. Or its summer reason. Because hidden beneath the beautiful language of liberty was one of America's greatest contradictions. The new nation spoke about freedom, while slavery remained legal. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved black people lived in a country declaring that human beings possessed rights. America had won freedom from Britain while denying freedom to many people within its own borders, and that contradiction would eventually tear the nation apart. But first, America nearly collapsed for another reason. Here is another part of the story many people never hear. After defeating Britain, the United States did not immediately have the powerful federal government it has today. Its first national system operated under the Articles of Confederation, and it was incredibly weak. The central government could not directly impose taxes. It struggled to regulate trade. States argued among themselves. The government had debts it could barely pay. Even George Washington and other leading figures feared the young country could fall apart. Think about that. America had defeated the British Empire, only to risk destroying itself. So in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were supposed to repair the existing system. Instead, they created something far more ambitious. The United States Constitution. A stronger federal government was born, and George Washington would eventually become the country's first president under the new Constitution. But America's hunger was growing. It wanted more land, more wealth, more power, and that expansion would come at an enormous human cost. America pushed westward. New territories were claimed. Settlers moved across the continent. But these lands were not empty. Indigenous nations stood in the way of American expansion. Treaties were signed. Many were broken. Communities were displaced. Wars were fought. Thousands died. At the same time, another question became impossible to ignore. Would slavery expand with America? The North and South increasingly disagreed. Politics became poisonous. Violence grew. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southern states began leaving the Union. And in 1861, America went to war against itself. The American Civil War became one of the biggest conflicts in the nation's history. Brother against brother, state against state, union against confederacy. Entire towns were devastated, and as the war continued, slavery moved to the center of the struggle. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the war. The American Civil War became one of the biggest conflicts in the nation's history. Then, in 1865, the Union defeated the Confederacy. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States, except as punishment for crime. America had survived, but just days after the war was effectively won, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The president who had led the country through its greatest internal crises was dead, and America entered another uncertain chapter. But the nation did not stop growing. Railways stretched across the continent. Factories multiplied. Oil created enormous fortunes. Steel built cities. Millions of immigrants arrived looking for opportunity. New York grew. Chicago exploded. Industrial giants emerged. America was transforming from a young republic into an economic machine. Then the world went to war. Twice.
When World War II ended in 1945, much of Europe and Asia had been devastated, but the United States emerged with enormous industrial, military, and economic power. America was no longer censoring, it had become a global superpower. But there was another superpower standing across from it, the Soviet Union.
And for decades, the two nations lived under the shadow of nuclear destruction. This became the Cold War, no massive direct war between the two superpowers, but conflicts erupted around the world. Korea, Vietnam, espionage, coups, nuclear missiles, a race for technological supremacy. And then America decided to do something almost unbelievable. Put a human being on the moon.
On July 20,
On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped into the lunar surface. For millions watching television around the world, America seemed unstoppable. But back on Earth, another battle was raging inside the country. Black Americans were demanding rights that had been denied for generations.
equal rights now, we demand justice!
Figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. became symbols of a movement demanding that America finally live up to its promise of equality. The country was changing again. Then came a morning that changed modern America forever. September 11, 2001, hijacked planes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Thousands were killed. The images were broadcast across the world. America responded with a global war on terror. Wars followed: Afghanistan, Iraq. American foreign policy changed dramatically. Technology, computers, the internet, smartphones, quiet media.
Companies born in garages and university campuses grew into corporations influencing billions of people. American power was no longer only carried by soldiers, aircraft carriers, and nuclear weapons. It traveled through Hollywood, music, the dollar, technology, social media, and the internet itself. Think about the journey. A land inhabited by indigenous nations, European empires fighting over territory, 13 British colonies rebelling against a king, a new nation that nearly collapsed after gaining independence, a country torn apart by slavery and civil war, an industrial giant, a nuclear superpower, a nation that placed humans on the moon, and eventually a country whose culture, companies, military, and politics would influence almost every corner of the planet. But history leaves us with one uncomfortable truth. No empire remains at the top forever. Rome once seemed unstoppable. Britain once controlled territories across the globe. Spain once commanded an enormous empire. They all discovered the same thing. Power can rise faster than anyone expects, and disappear faster than anyone believes. So perhaps the most fascinating chapter of American history is not the one behind us. It is the one happening right now. Can America remain one of the world's dominant powers? Or are we watching the beginning of another great historical shift? God Bless America is a story for another episode. Subscribe to History with Kalito, because here, we don't just tell you the history you already know, we uncover the history they rarely tell you.